You're at Lake Rant, where I rant about whatever my $15 a month plus patrons want me to rant about. You can get one of these by being one of those. This one's for Languid Landscape Lad, who says, rant about how different genres of fiction seem to thrive in some mediums and suffer in others. For example, I far prefer fantasy to sci-fi when it comes to books and video games, but the reverse is true when it comes to movies, TV shows, and anime. Maybe that's just me. You know, I immediately, reading this, thought about shandification, the concept that Mr. B-Tongue introduced in his video, the shandification of Fallout, talking about the ability to sort of randomly explore a story in whichever direction you want, to fill in details and go all over the place. And I think that uh, video games in particular, I mean, he talks about this in the video, they are extremely good for creating shandified narratives because the player's control allows them to basically pay attention to whatever parts of the story they feel like, assuming that the story is, constructed well to allow for it. So, I think that fantasy worlds, a huge part of what makes them interesting is the world building. It's all the different systems, all the distinct ways that they work and how society ends up being built around all of those strange little things. And that is more interesting than usually the plot because, if you're in a fantasy setting, then the storyline is most likely either going to be political or about heroes defeating a bad guy. Either way, it's nothing like so unique that it necessitates tight storytelling in the same way that a film does. Like a great film is about telling a great story in the span of 2 hours. A great fantasy work is usually about creating a great world, a really interesting, home for its characters. So, aside from video games being so good at that, novels also tend to, they can kind of be as long as they want. The pacing is more or less, I won't say it's controlled by the reader, but, there's more of the option to take your time, drink in different details. I just think it lends itself better to the presentation of random errant facts that have nothing to do with the central storyline, and are more about world building. Whereas in a movie, you would cut a lot of that stuff out the second that you realize you only had 2 hours to tell your story. So sci-fi, on the other hand, while it can have those world building elements and be interesting in that way, a game like Mass Effect is a great sci-fi universe. It tends to be that the intrigue in sci-fi is more in the speculation of like what would the inclusion of this element into society do to it. You could say that's similar to fantasy in a way, but fantasy is usually more about applying it to a world we already know, like ancient history, but with a twist, where there's magic or something's a little bit different. And, while you could create a society that is like fundamentally different from the one we already have, usually it's more about making something that's like close to what exists and different in these interesting little subtle ways. Whereas I feel like with sci-fi, the point of it is to think, okay, well, if we have interdimensional travel, like how does this affect humanity? What kind of new problems arise? If we are traveling through space, or what kind of, what will happen to the world if people can put their brains into computers and shit like that. And I think that movies and TV shows are just a lot better suited to covering that kind of material. Not that I don't think video games or books could do it just as well. I think that, all of them are great ways to do sci-fi, but like the sci-fi genre survives that transition better because you can hone it down to its core point and it still more or less makes sense and it's still an interesting story. You don't have to go into tons and tons of world building to talk about why this one cool sci-fi idea that's at the center of your story is interesting. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the biggest distinction with those two genres in particular. It would be interesting to think about all kinds of genres and like what they fit best into. Like, it's rare that you find video games that do romance well, which is something that movies and TV shows have no problem with, just because it's harder to simulate romance than it is to, simulate just kind of passively observing a world and having conversations with people where they just kind of dump what they're thinking onto you. Yeah, I definitely think that different mediums, you got to play to the strength of your medium if you want to make the best genre work you possibly can.